I hope that you're doing well and that you've had a good week. It is Friday, and we've had an eventful week in here, but we aren't quite done. We're still discussing economic voting, and we're considering economic voting one way that voters hold politicians and parties accountable or don't, depending upon how much voting actually takes place or how much economic voting actually takes place. And we did a reading by Harding, and we've been focusing a lot on types of economic voting, and we've seen some examples that included India, the United States, and some others. So there's a lot here, and so far we've addressed this in a way that is very broad and is very conceptual. We've talked about the logic of economic voting and whether or not voters are holding leaders and parties accountable by punishing them or rewarding them and incentivizing their behavior. We've considered whether or not they are forecasting and considering among a variety of different potential teams in the economic policies that they might bring. And in general, we agreed that whether or not voters are forecasting or sanctioning may depend on the type of election. But what you'll see today is that whether or not economic voting is taking place also may depend on the context and the circumstances, because there's considerable variation either from election to election or from country to country and context to context into what degree voters actually appear to be voting economically. And so we'll take a look at some of the variation, and we'll consider some of the evidence. This is going to be partly methodological too, because we're going to try to think about ways that we would examine or evaluate the different circumstances that would make economic voting more or less likely. So we'll introduce comparative methods at the end as a tool that we could use to understand diversity, but we'll set things up by first considering some of the evidence and some of the patterns that come from the literature as we know it, and as we know economic voting to take place in practice. So let me get started here and put this up. So studies of economic voting are not created equal. The truth is that there are at least two different types, and we can distinguish them based on the level at which they are conducted. So the most common type seems to be the comparative aggregate level type. This is where the data set includes maybe all countries of the world or as many as possible. And the idea is to compare a large number of countries to each other at a very, very high level of aggregation and see to what extent there are links between economic voter preferences and actual voting outcomes across those different country cases in the data set. Then there are the individual level studies where a single country is examined. And in this instance, you're not looking at individual countries, but individual voters. And the data set doesn't include countries, but voters or individuals within the data set. These are two different types of studies, and they work in different ways. Let me pause and take a look at the yes, good question. Which is better, apples or oranges? They are different. They are different, but they have some similarities because they're both fruits. It's just that they have different tastes and so on. But returning to the main event, to undo this a little further, comparative studies are looking at the big picture and comparing as many countries as possible. And what they're doing is they're looking at the relationship between the conditions in the economy and voter preferences. When they do this, they are necessarily aggregating a lot of information at a very, very high level. And that's why comparative aggregate level studies are so different than the individual level studies, which examine the relationship between the economy and the preferences of individual voters in a single country. And so again, the differences between countries and individual voters. this is a different way of approaching the question, depending upon whether you think about individuals or countries as a whole. In all cases, though, the dependent variable is usually the same, and it's the incumbent vote share. Now, that's important because that implies that we're already looking at and considering and analyzing and evaluating the incumbent, not necessarily the alternative. The assumption baked into this choice of variable seems to be that when voters are voting economically, they're voting and they're addressing the incumbent. They're not making a judgment about the alternative, which is interesting considering that the forecasting model assumes that and treats voting as involving estimates of future potential gains. And so this choice of variable matters a great deal because there's great consistency between studies in the use of this variable. And it seems to be one thing that the literature agrees on, in addition to the simple fact that economic voting does exist as a thing. And in terms of the relationship between the economy and voter preferences, we're conceiving and thinking about the economy usually in terms of a few key measures. And those include employment, unemployment, inflation. Employment is the rate of employed people. Unemployment is the rate of unemployment. Inflation has to do with the rise in the price structure. All three of these are different indicators or measures of the health of the economy, but all three of them provide some portrait of the health of the economy. And so they've ordinarily been used to capture that variable. And you'll see in a moment, and you've no doubt seen already, that sometimes economic considerations flow from other types of circumstances that may not relate as directly to employment, unemployment, inflation. In particular, different contexts might present different sorts of circumstances that matter, or different factors or different variables that matter. And this is where we begin to introduce the paper by Harding. And this is such an interesting paper because it, of course, it's highly sophisticated in its method and its treatment of this issue, but it's also interesting and sort of anecdotal and provides a snapshot of the case or cases assessed in that paper. And the point here is that studies can differ in very important ways. And even though traditionally some key economic measures like inflation, employment, and unemployment have prevailed, there are other ways of looking at it too. And the first question I want to ask you is, what type of study does Harding exemplify? Is this a comparative aggregate level study, or is this an individual level study, and why? Good, Tessa. If you're thinking about this and you'd like to comment or share your input, you can use the chat and tell me and the others. Alternatively, you can also tell the class via the mic if you would like. But this is a question that I would expect you to be able to answer if you've completed the reading.
Yeah, it's an individual level study because it's discussing the voter preferences of the people of Ghana. It's not comparing Ghana to like other countries in Africa, for example.
Right. So that means the data set that Harding worked with has individual voters as the parts of the data set as opposed to countries. And so that means that data set might look very different. It might be much larger, but we're going to primarily be learning about Ghana, right? We're not going to be learning about other African countries or other experiences. But even so, we can learn a great deal from that individual level study because our central question is really the same. What is the relationship between the state of the economy and the vote, the vote of the citizens? What's the link? So this is an individual level study that is taking on the question of that basic link between the state of the economy and the vote. And if you said individual level, you of course are correct. It's useful for us to think about these basics because we're going to be thinking about each paper that we come across in this class in a similar set of ways, and we'll try to analyze and evaluate them using similar approaches. Now, let's get into this a little bit further. And what I'd like to ask you to do is comment via the chat at first, and let's just kind of germinate for a moment and see if we can get as many students to share their input as possible. And the next question I want to pose to you is what is the economic variable that is used, or what is the sort of key economic factor that Harding is using to explain the economic vote, or to explain or to elucidate this relationship between the state of the economy and the incumbent vote share? What is that measure, and why was it chosen? Think about this for a moment, reflect on your notes or the reading that you completed, but I do want you to comment in the chat, and I should be careful what I ask for because there are so many of you that I might be overrun, but think about this. And if you're prepared to share your input, go ahead and go for it when you're ready. So we're already getting some responses rolling in via direct message, which is totally, totally viable. We do want to hear from as many students as possible. Brittany is providing input, and Brittany is on point, although I do want to shelter some of these responses here for a moment as students come rolling in. Looks like Zeri is also right on point. Good, good. Other students who want to share their input or their answer to this question. We're getting a lot of really good detail here. I'm so happy to see that many of you are going beyond just sort of the question of the measure and talking about how even the institutions of democracy itself in Ghana have a sort of role to play, or at least relate to this issue. Good, good. Yes, Virginia, you're right on point. Um, there's a lot of really good consistency here, and if you're a student who's yet to respond, but you're thinking road maintenance, changes in local road maintenance, that's the answer. That's the variable that is used in this study. And specifically, I'll even quote or read Ishan's message. He says the economic measure was the amount of money that was spent on roads that were close to them. This was chosen because there is a direct link between the executive and road development, unlike other industries in Ghana. As Tessa points out down below, moreover, in adding to this, road maintenance is centralized in Ghana. And that means that the executive, the president, is in charge, or the prime minister or the executive is in charge. That means that whenever you're voting in that election, that presidential election, it is a presidential system, sorry, pardon me. You're voting basically for the continuation of the road policy or for an alternative. And it becomes an economic vote. And because the executive is in charge of roads, responsibility for roads can't be attributed to any other institution or any other body. And so it becomes a very, very direct sort of link between the voter and the state of the economy when they vote on behalf of roads in that presidential election, or when they vote based on a preference for road maintenance or road spending. It becomes then a really useful test in a really useful context to examine the economic vote. And as other students point out correctly, including Brittany, it was road quality, Zeri road maintenance, Harja says the impact of roads. And Tessa adds a lot of nice detail here too. Non-clientelistic goods such as road condition, because it is monitored centrally and it reflects the ability of local producers to sell their goods. Since it is centralized, it's associated with the executive. Exactly. And so that means then that voting in executive presidential elections directly implicates road policy and directly impacts on road policy. And of course, as Tessa also adds, this is meaningful in Ghana because it's a developing country and production and expansion of the economy depends on the pavement and maintenance of roads that connect population centers and that connect markets and make it possible to distribute goods and to grow the economy. Ernie says transportation to maintenance. Virginia says average road condition change. Yes. Hargan says road maintenance budget votes versus good distribution. Local road condition, says Kevin. One issue that came up in this reading and that the author Harding had to deal with right up front was the question of the relative importance of clientelistic practices. We'll see what this means later in the course, but in short, clientelistic practices relate to patron-client relationships. This is where a party or a leader basically purchases the votes of a constituency or their supporters. They pay them more or less to vote for them. And in Africa, as well as in many Latin American countries, this is quite common. And so in a study like this, you have to be able to show persuasively that it doesn't actually stem from clientelism, the voting that takes place in presidential elections, that it's actually shaped by the state of the economy, and in particular, the change in the local maintenance of roads. And so this is a really neat paper because it gets into the circumstances in Ghana and why the state of the economy in Ghana has a lot to do with the condition of local roads. And it then differentiates itself from these other studies that primarily have looked at more advanced or developed countries and figured and emphasize things like inflation and employment rates. Changes to the condition of local roads is that key measure that's used by Harding. And the reason it's used is because local road maintenance is a driver of development in Ghana. And roads and communications networks and transportation, these are all drivers of development in all countries. But in a developing country, they become especially important because these roads in the maintenance of these roads and the expansion of markets and the networking of cities and towns and population centers, it contributes to exponential growth because of how it connects markets and creates opportunities for distribution that didn't previously exist. And so you can really see and imagine how that would become quite politically important in a place like Ghana, where voters are voting based upon the extent to which the economy is improved and the change in the economy. When you can link that so directly to road maintenance, you can begin to see a clear example of economic voting. And so Ghana's interesting. The year 2020, for example, was the year of the roads, as they called it in Ghana. Even though the paper we looked at was, I believe, data between 2004 and 2008, even though that was many years ago, Ghana remains focused on paving roads and developing roads. And road construction is financed by the Ghana Road Fund, which is, of course, a road fund that falls under the purview of the executive, under which road maintenance is centralized. And that's the link, that institutional link that makes road maintenance a useful proxy for economic voting in Ghana. And so in 2020, Ghanaians also went to the polls, and lo and behold, they went to the polls here in the midst of the coronavirus. And as in many other countries of the world, the economy and economic conditions were the most important considerations for voters. And not just that, but roads and continued development and expansion and a robust investment by the state in an effort to sort of counteract the economic slowdown brought by the coronavirus was a big part of this. So let's actually watch a video that puts this in perspective for us, talks about the presidential elections, and discusses the economy in Ghana.
Polls opened a short while ago in Ghana for an election where the president and the former president are both offering promises to help the economy rebound from its first quarterly contraction in nearly 40 years. The election watched closely to see if the West African economic powerhouse can maintain its standard as a bastion of democracy in the unstable region where election disputes this year have really fanned fears of a slide back into authoritarianism. Let's cross to Accra, speak to correspondent Sam Bradpiece, who joins us from there. Sam, Ghana's seen as the economic powerhouse. There's still a lot of poverty, though, isn't there? That's one of the main issues there.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. If you look at the national poverty rate, according to the latest government figures, we're talking at about 23%. So undoubtedly, underdevelopment and poverty is an issue in Ghana, but it is worth mentioning that since the early 2000s, millions have been lifted out of poverty here. There are, again, it's worth mentioning, stark regional inequalities, though. If you look at somewhere like Accra, the capital, where we are now, you can see the polling station already filling up behind me. The poverty rate here is only about 2%, whereas if you go to the northern regions, you know, we're going almost into the 40s. So really quite significant regional variations here in Ghana. But you are absolutely right, Stuart. It's worth mentioning that through strong oil, gold, cocoa exports, the economy has thrived here over recent decades. In fact, in the last decade alone, we're looking at an average growth rate of about 7%. And all of this is tied in with the country's political stability. Since 1992, the country has held a series of seamless elections with very few kind of contentious issues, very few contested elections, and that has all contributed to the kind of climate whereby the economy has grown and people have been lifted from poverty.
So, Sam, what's the choice of voters there? I mean, there are 12 candidates, aren't there? But it's rather a two-horse race, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. Really, there are 12 candidates officially standing, according to the Electoral Commission. But even independents that you speak with, I spoke with someone who's standing as an independent MP here because there are parliamentary elections happening at the same time. And even he admitted to me that when it comes to the race for the presidency, there are just two candidates. Effectively, we're talking about John Mahama, the former president, who's standing as the opposition candidate, and the incumbent, Nana Akufo-Addo. Now, when you look at these two candidates, this is the third time that they've faced off, and it will also be the last time because the Ghanaian presidency sets a two-term limit on presidential terms. So really, this is the last time they'll face off. Most analysts you speak to say it really is too close to call. About 5% of the Ghanaian population are swing voters. It's that 5% who will really decide what way this election goes. But for the moment, any analyst you speak to, and any actually Ghanaian you speak with, even in the streets, will tell you that simply we don't know who's going to win. But likely it will be John Mahama or Nana Akufo-Addo.
Sam, thanks very much. Sam Bradpiece, our correspondent, talking to us there live from Accra. Polls opened a short...
So what's the significance of those natural resource exports and those lucrative revenues that flowed into state coffers in previous decades? Where the significance is that those revenues financed the road expansion. The maintenance of the roads and the pavement of the roads was made possible by those revenues in that natural resource commodity boom that benefited both Latin American and African countries. And when countries create those sovereign wealth funds where they channel or sort of divert some of the revenue from commodity exports, they accumulate large reserves that they can then devote to specific political and economic and social objectives. And so in Ghana, as in other countries, those wealth funds have been used for often developmental purposes. Now, what's interesting is that this video highlighted how poverty rates remain much higher in some parts of the country than in the capital, Accra, where they're relatively low. My guess is that in those areas with much lower rates of poverty, road maintenance and construction has been much more widespread than in some of those poorer regions. And it may be that there's even variation in the kind and the type of economic voting and the extent to which voters are engaging in economic voting, maybe based on those differences between the regions. Now, what's interesting about this example in my suggestion, in what's interesting about the literature at large, is that there's quite a bit of variation in economic voting. Despite evidence of its existence, which we clearly can see, there's a lot of variation from country to country and from time period to time period and context to context. Sometimes it appears more important than other times, and less times it seems unimportant compared to other countries or other circumstances. And so one study at the aggregate level showed that European states over a course of many, many, many years did not exhibit a consistent effect for economic voting. None of the traditional measures, be it employment, unemployment, or inflation, appeared to be robust and consistent, which seems surprising given the agreement among scholars in the literature. And individual level studies have also been somewhat fraught with this inconsistency. So the effect has been apparent in France and in Britain, not so much in Norway or Italy. This is really interesting because some of these countries aren't that different, and there must be some reason why the economic voting is more important in some cases than others. And even in Denmark, for example, personal economic conditions were more crucial to voting than were socioeconomic or perspective or different sorts of economic voting. And then there's a lot of variation when you really come to it and you conclude and you look at the big picture. A lot of questions emerge when we consider this variation. And this is where I want to begin to incorporate your input. And I'd like us to begin to think outside of the box and think critically and creatively about when and why economic voting might matter and when and why it might not. And the questions that come up for me and that come up in the most recent writings that reflect on the advances in this literature include, first, why would economic voting be more important in some countries or contexts than others? Why does it vary? We agree that it does exist, but it seems to exist more at some points in time or in some places than others, and what accounts for that variation. And then more straightforwardly, when does the economy decide the vote and when does it not? These are our questions. As comparativists working in this literature, as scholars who examine differences and similarities across countries and in cases and time periods to try to understand things more systematically, I'd like to pose this question to you. What do you think might account for variation in the importance of economic voting? Do you think that this has to do with changes in economic conditions? Do you think that it has to do with exposure to the global economy? Does it have to do with maybe the income level? What's really going on here? And when does economic voting get triggered? And when does it not? I'd like us to just think creatively and think outside of the box for just a moment. Does anyone have any ideas about why economic voting might decide the vote sometimes, but then not other times? One useful way of thinking about this might be to just reflect on the video that we just watched about the case of Ghana. And why is it that the presidential election candidates, the candidates for president, emphasized the economy? Is there something going on that made that particularly salient for voters, or that seemed to them to be a reason to emphasize the economy and maybe how they would govern? Oscar says high unemployment, making people worry about their income. Okay, so if people are unemployed in large numbers, more people are going to be worried about their income and more consistently. Okay, certainly, right? When unemployment is higher, we can imagine that economic voting might become more important. Whereas if unemployment is relatively low, people might not be consciously thinking about the economy that much, right? They might be thankful that they're doing okay, but they might not be thinking, oh, I'm doing so great that I'll reward the incumbent. And maybe then they'll vote for some other reason. Arlene says big drops in the market might be blamed on the political leaders, so people don't want them to remain in office. Okay, so if there's like a deep crisis, right? If there's a big drop off and there's a sudden increase in unemployment, either due to a sudden economic crisis or something, maybe an acute crisis can make economic voting important and can raise the importance of the economic vote. So Chris is describing inflation and the rise in the prices for basic commodities like milk, and how large corporations might be perceived to be driving up costs through collusion and monopolies. Certainly, it's possible that people might have a perception of unfairness, and maybe they vote for a candidate who taps into those grievances or who might speak to that sort of sense or that awareness of economic unfairness or the way that that inflation has affected their lives. Certainly, Stephanie says it might be because if the economy is good at the time, it won't be a priority, while if it's bad, that it would be more important. Touche, Stephanie. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that voters will vote based on corruption as an issue during bad economic times, but they will look the other way and vote on the basis of other issues during good economic times. So that's very similar to your reasoning, which is that, well, look, during a crisis, they're likely to blame the government, but if there's a good economy, they might not think much about it and they might actually vote for some other reason. So maybe the economic circumstances matter a great deal. Alondra says lack of access to basic necessities related to income levels. So if there's a lot of inflation, that certainly matters. And if it's sudden, that could affect support for the incumbent. So if you can't afford healthcare because of a rise in prices, that certainly will likely affect the survival of the incumbent if it's a pervasive concern that people have. Ishan says shocks to the economy may cause people to care about the economy more, like a migrant crisis in France or in European countries, but not as much in Norway. So maybe there are these events that are perceived as very substantial and impactful, and they affect the perceptions or the sense that people have about the economy. Tessa says, would it coincide with modernization processes in places where democracies are still developing? Totally. So when we think of modernization, if we mean economic development and then gains in education and literacy and health attainment and achievement, it could be that people vote based on the economy when they feel as though they've obtained those things. And maybe then economic and social development and rapid development can lead to economic voting. Aiden says if people are better off financially, when the election is around, they will tend to vote for the incumbent. Interesting. So Aiden, do you think that there's sort of, and you don't have to answer this, this is sort of just hypothetical and for anyone, is there kind of a middle ground where maybe the economy is not in crisis or even in recession, but maybe it's not, growing quickly either, and it's just sort of okay, where people are just kind of indifferent, and maybe in that case they're more likely to think about, some other set of issues? It's possible. And one thing that's come up is that there are often not just economic and political circumstances that might vary and that might make economic voting more important, but there also are often unique political and economic experiences that countries have that can trigger or depress economic voting. And so one really interesting and noteworthy example is Italy during the sort of post-war period, where by the early 1980s, the country had essentially one-party rule by the Christian Democrats for the entire post-war period. And it's possible that that depressed the economic vote. If people were less inclined to vote based upon the economy due to continual one-party rule, it may have been the case that fewer people voted. Maybe they were voting for other reasons. Maybe in that sort of circumstance, there was a lot of momentum that took away from the economic considerations that might otherwise have shaped the vote. That's one circumstance that's very unique that most countries don't have. Alternatively, some countries do have that experience. Mexico, for instance, had one party rule for almost the entirety of the 20th century. And that party was relatively effective, moderately so, in developing the economy. And it could be that sometimes one party rule or popular parties can insulate themselves from economic consequences or the political consequences of their economic policies. Now, anyone who knows the Mexican case well knows that the PRI wasn't really a democratic party in the sense that it was an authoritarian party that rigged elections and it remained in power. But the point is, economic voting may be less important or less likely in situations where there's one party rule or there are political circumstances that are unique and that might take away from the economic vote. In Norway, the world economy is a highly important factor in the performance of the domestic economy because they're so exposed to the world economy. They rely a great deal on international trade. And it's possible that this exposure to the world economy negates the economic vote. If voters know that there's actually less a government can do, given how exposed we are to the international economy, they might be voting for other reasons, right? They may just decide, well, it's actually the international economy that's mostly dictating the performance of the domestic economy. It's not the national government. And so therefore I won't be voting on the basis of the circumstances in the economy. It's possible. Other countries show a different pattern. It seems to be the case that in some countries, perceptions of economic outcomes are different than the actual outcomes themselves. And so sometimes perceptions matter more than reality, in which case the sort of image of the rational, fully informed economic voter doesn't hold up, and the economic voting doesn't appear to be as important and as relevant when it comes to election day. Now, this is one way of looking at it. Consider, for instance, if we take a look at the relationship between trade openness and the vote share of the incumbent prime minister's party in European countries. What you notice first and foremost is that there is sort of a relationship between them, right? You see the line of best fit. It does appear to be the case that when countries are more open to the economy, maybe economic voting is more important. Although the case of Norway seems to be, like we said a moment ago, inconsistent with that pattern because it shows that despite relative openness, there's less economic voting. But what I want you to notice is that there's a lot of deviations from the norm. There are a lot of outliers. It's not a very clean line. It's not a very good fit. What that means then is there's obviously a lot of unique circumstances at the national level in these different countries that might sort of obviate or even enhance the economic vote. And those circumstances might be unique to those countries, or they might be unique to sets of countries or sub-regions within within Europe, and so on and so forth. Even when we try to examine the relationship between the mean economic vote and trade openness, it still appears to be the case that there's a lot of noise. There's just a lot of other stuff that could be going on in these individual cases. And so the challenge for us as comparativists is to explain this contextual variation. It's to figure out in a systematic, analytical way what is going on when does the economic vote prevail and when does it not? And, when does trade openness appear to, cause economic voting and when does it not? Or when does unemployment matter and when does it not? And so on and so forth. What we have to do is try to figure out what sorts of political and economic circumstances do some of the work under the hood. So far, what we know is that economic voting exists, it is real, it is observable basically everywhere, but with important exceptions and with some contextual variation that we can only understand by kind of looking underneath the hood and taking a look at circumstances inside countries. And so at this stage, we can imagine a lot of different strategies for doing this. We can imagine different ways of trying to get at that variation in that sort of interesting nuance that comes up when we consider some of the deviations from the norm or the expectations that we came to this discussion with. And one way of doing it, in one way that we'll do in this class, is by using comparison to isolate on key similarities and differences among a small number of carefully selected cases. And so what that basically means is picking out similar or different countries and then trying to figure out what is different between them or similar between them, and it could potentially account for the similarity or the differences between them in the extent of economic voting. So if economic voting mattered in France, well, did it matter in Germany? If it was less important in Germany, what was it that happened in France that made it important in France, but not so important in Germany? What about in Norway? What about Norway and Finland, for example? Did economic voting take place in Finland? It seemed to be less important in Norway. Was there something that happened in Finland that didn't happen in Norway that would explain why economic voting was more important in Finland but not in Norway? This is a strategy that focuses on a small number of carefully selected cases. We're deliberately choosing cases because of their values on the variables of interest. We're deliberately selecting them because our objective is to figure out, intentionally, our objective is to figure out, well, when does this economic voting matter and when doesn't it? What differentiates or unites these cases? In this class, we're going to introduce two methods that can be used to tease out and understand and explain this cross-national variation in economic voting. These approaches come from John Stuart Mill, who's pictured here. He's leering at us. And although he said that these should not be used in the social sciences, we're going to make him roll in his grave and use them anyway, because these are widely used in comparative politics and they're used as well by behaviorists. We're going to use them to try to understand some of these contextual variations. We're going to use them to experience and evaluate countries as whole entities instead of looking at them as dots and parts of a data set. The reason that we'll do this in this class is because this isn't a set of approaches that we can use with minimal startup costs. We don't need a statistical package or Stata or R or whatever we might need to analyze large data sets. All we really need are pieces of knowledge about the countries that we're analyzing, some contextual information and some insight and some creativity, and we can begin to generate some hypotheses that we could subsequently test in those large data sets and those large analyses. And so in this class, those two methods that come from John Stuart Mill are the method of difference and the method of agreement. And the method of difference, in a nutshell, compares and contrasts cases with similar traits, but different outcomes. And we're looking consciously for clues as to why those cases differ. So if our outcome is incumbent vote share. And we're trying to figure out, well, when does economic voting account for incumbent vote share and when doesn't it? We would want to pick out two cases where incumbent vote share is related to economic vote in one and where it's unrelated to it in the other. And then we would try to analyze the link between the economic vote and the vote share. We try to figure out under what circumstances did that economic vote get triggered in that case where it appears to be at work. And then what circumstances similarly were absent in that case where there was no economic vote. This is the method of difference. And while imperfect, it's a useful method because it gets to the very, very nitty gritty of cases that have precisely the values that we need to try to understand and tease out some puzzle or some picture that's incomplete based on our understanding of the data. The method of agreement is precisely the opposite of the method of difference. This is where you compare and contrast cases with different traits, but similar outcomes for clues as to why they agree. And so in this approach, both cases show a link between economic voting and incumbent vote share. And in these cases, the countries otherwise are very, very different along a whole bunch of other dimensions of interest. So maybe they're very different geographically or socially or politically or economically, but they still show the same relationship. In this case, we would want to try to figure out, well, what other circumstances in place in both of those cases so as to forge such a tight link between the economic vote and the incumbent vote share. These are approaches that we can enumerate sort of as a series of steps. This is a series of steps that you can take in any situation to try to understand variation, inform or test hypotheses. And in this case, we can do it with incumbent vote share and economic voting, just as we could with democratic transitions and economic development, and say a class on democratization. But we'll walk through this step by step. And before we do it, let me take a look at the chat because I think someone asked a question. These methods will help you, Chris. Absolutely. You could use these methods if you chose to. You could also consider other approaches that you find in the reading or that you might like as well. But these would be just as valid if you chose to use them. And I personally use these methods in my own research. And so they are methods that can be fruitfully applied. So with the method of difference, the first step is first to find two or more very similar cases where the outcome of interest varies. So if the outcome of interest is the incumbent vote share, and we're looking for the relationship between the economic vote and incumbent vote share, or if we're looking for the role of the economic vote, we want to find two cases where they're very, very similar socially, politically, economically, historically, geographically, perhaps, but where economic voting seems to be much more prevalent in one case than the other. That is the variation that we're explaining, the variation in economic voting. And the goal is to identify why there's more economic voting in one country than the other. And what we do to identify that is look for the factor or the regard in which these similar countries differ. And that then becomes the key factor that we look at and use to explain variation in the outcome. So I gave you the example of, say, France and Germany. And I noted that economic voting seemed to be more important in France. And I considered there may be something different in France as compared to Germany. Well, it's interesting to note that Germany is more exposed to the global economy. Like Norway, they are very much integrated in the global economy and they rely a lot on the export of finished products like washing machines and cars. If it's the case that exposure to the international economy negates economic voting, that might explain why economic voting is lower in Germany and higher in France. It's just a hypothesis that I've generated as a way of potentially explaining or accounting for that variation. And again, this goes back to that key challenge facing us as comparativists in comparative political behavior, explaining what triggers economic voting and what negates economic voting. And although we're not quite done, we do have no more time tonight. So we'll finish this on Monday and we'll begin our new unit on Monday and we'll address our new unit next week. But this does conclude or at least finish us up for today. I'm going to stop recording and